Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is sponsored by Lumo. The topic today is the irrigation execution gap, the difference between how much you plan to irrigate your vines and the volume of water they actually received. There are several reasons this gap exists, and of course, closing it is essential for your crop quality. Here to talk about that, we have several experts, and before we kick it over to them to get us started, I have a quick technical note for you. This webinar is pre-recorded, but all the experts are with us in the live chat. So if you have questions along the way, just pop them into the live chat and they'll answer them there as we go along. Now with that, let me kick it over to Josh to get us started.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Kim. It's great to be here. My name is Josh Zoland. I am with Lumo. I'm the Senior Program Manager. Today, we're going to be talking about closing the irrigation execution gap. We will define what that gap is, what is the difference between an irrigation recommendation and the actual implementation out on a ranch. We have some great panelists with us here today. I'm super excited to be speaking with Mark Greenspan, Loni Lyttle of Advanced Viticulture, as well as Hunter Emch. So here at Lumo, my focus is to empower growers, partners, and our internal team to irrigate with precision and efficiency. If you haven't heard of us, Lumo is the world's first smart valve with a built-in flow sensor for agricultural irrigation. We provide growers with wireless valve automation and full accountability, so full data feedback. Prior to Lumo, I was working in viticulture consulting with a focus on agricultural technology and in public relations for wine and spirits. Hunter Emch is the Northern Area Unit Manager for Redwood Empire Vineyard Management. He oversees dozens of ranches, irrigators, and crews across northern Sonoma County. And he's previously worked as a vineyard manager in the up-and-coming Virginia wine region. Mark Greenspan is the president of Advanced Viticulture Consulting. He holds a PhD in agricultural engineering, a master's degree in viticulture, and a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, all from UC Davis. Mark is also a certified crop advisor and certified professional agronomist, a regular contributor to wine industry publications, and previously served as president of the American Society of Viticulture and Enology. And last but certainly not least, Loni Lyttle is the director of viticulture for Advanced Viticulture Consulting. She holds a master's degree from the University of Turin in Italy, and she's also a certified crop advisor and pest control advisor. So what is the irrigation execution gap? What are we discussing today? The irrigation execution gap is the gap between the volume of water that you want to apply in the field and the volume that you are actually delivering in the field. We know that there is variability in irrigation systems, in planning, in labor constraints, and so all of these factors impact what is delivered to the crops. Now, Mark and Loni, I want to turn to you first, and because you provide your clients with data-based irrigation recommendations as a core function of your consulting business. So how have you seen this gap manifest over the years? Is it human error? Is it the reality of irrigation systems and management practices? Both? What are some examples? What do you most commonly observe?
I'll start, Lonnie will finish. Whatever I miss. I've seen it all, Josh, and so all of the above is to answer your question. We've seen everything from, well, let me back up just a bit. We do our recommendations based on numerous factors, but one of probably the most important factors is soil moisture, and we look at the soil moisture profile using soil moisture probes. And that's kind of the fundamental part of what guides how much we can irrigate at one time. At least that's a big part of it. It also tells us how often. But the big mistake I think that's commonly made is irrigating to a volume that doesn't really match the soil profile. And so that usually comes across as, well, we want you to irrigate. We suggest you irrigate. Say 5 hours, because we've seen a 5-hour irrigation percolate to the bottom of the root system. Anything beyond that is mostly wasted irrigation. And so we'll say that, and then the grower will turn the pump on and the irrigation system on before they leave in the evening, and turn it off next morning. that's an extreme case, but did happen to us several times, many times, or something to that effect. They may ignore or mistakenly not forget to turn a valve off, or maybe they just need to go take a break for lunch, and they want to turn the system off before they do that. There's a lot of human factors involved when you're irrigating. So there's that factor, and there's also the issue of systems not being uniformly applied, sometimes overcompensating because of that. If you have poor distribution uniformity in your system for one reason or another, usually it's low pressure, but it can be other factors. Sometimes they'll overcompensate by irrigating longer, thinking longer is better. I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but longer is not usually better, especially if you're talking about efficient application of water. You want to throw in some?
Yeah, I mean, just to sum up, yeah, I mean, there are limitations in your system, like how, feasible is it to irrigate a certain area at any given time? You have some situations where you have an overpowered pump, so you have to irrigate a certain area at one time. And you don't have an option of following up with my recommendation, which is like, look, just irrigate this particular area and don't irrigate anything else. But mostly what we see are places where, as Mark said, like the soil and the rootstock and all those things combined, it would be better if you could irrigate shorter sets more frequently. And that is usually when we end up getting into trouble, because there's just a limitation of labor. And yeah, especially for larger ranches or ranches with really limitations on the amount of water they have. So they have a ton of really small blocks, or they're a high-end producer, so they have a ton of small blocks anyway. And it literally takes 10 days for somebody to get around the entire vineyard irrigating. And if I say, hey, instead of irrigating 5 hours in one shot, we want you to irrigate 3 times for 2 hours each irrigation, it's just not going to go anywhere. Even if that is the ideal situation, a lot of what we just have to deal with is like, well, what can you feasibly do as a human? And what can your system handle? So those are definitely the limitations to just executing what we recommend. Yeah, and then there's no point of like, not that there's no point anyway, but like, you're following our recommendation, but our recommendation tells you to do something impossible. Yeah. Yeah,
in most cases, not everywhere, but 3 hour sets is not the same thing as 1 6 hour. Mm-hmm. It may be in some situations you can do that, per week I'm talking, but a lot of soils can't handle that, and because we're monitoring the soil profile in moisture content, we know that, but you can't most people don't know that unless they measure it. So, and then so it may just be a matter of inability to do it, but also maybe kind of a lack of appreciation for what it's doing. And so that's part of our process, is trying to show the grower, here's what's happening. At the end of the season, this is what you did, and this is how much water you kind of lost.
Right. So we see this distinction between what the science says is ideal, what the data says is ideal, between what's actually practical and what someone may be able or willing to do.
Right.
Yeah. And, that aligns with everything that we tend to see here at Lumo out in the field. Irrigation infrastructure issues and limitations, the labor constraints, manual errors out in the field, someone turned the wrong valve, or they read the work order incorrectly, and a lack of real-time visibility into the system's performance, what's actually happening in the block. What is the flow? Is there pressure being supplied as it should be to make it through the emitters properly? And Hunter, you're charged with implementing irrigation strategies across, dozens of ranches, and I think at least 1,000 acres. So at that scale, right, what causes of the execution gap do you most frequently observe?
Yeah, to piggyback kind of what on Loni and Mark have already stated, it is a lot of human error, or the inability to just get things done in an efficient way. I think the way I look at it, I've got maybe 1 or 2 people that can help me irrigate. I've got other guys that can potentially help turn systems on, but they're not going to know exactly where to go in the blocks to and be able to keep track of what's been turned on, what's been turned off. So really I can only get to so many ranches at once. And so just trying to coordinate the logistics of how much that I can control with those two guys. And really, I have to kind of coordinate, areas or territories, because it doesn't make sense to send someone all the way down south to Petaluma while I'm also trying to irrigate all the way up to as north as far as Boonville, and anywhere in between. You have to try to make things as efficient as possible. And then kind of going back to what you're saying, if we're trying to irrigate, smaller sets, 2-3 hours at a time, my irrigators it's a lot easier for them to be able to go turn a block on, leave it on for 6 hours, and then come back to it when they've done, several other ranches in that same way. If they're doing a smaller set, they have to shorten their distance to, for when they can come back to that ranch and turn the blocks off. So having that control is really sort of the being able to control that remotely has really been the number one thing that I've really enjoyed, being able to know precisely what's happening and being able to coordinate and schedule that as freely and as openly as I want, as opposed to relying on what the human can do. Because another big thing is that they're working just a 10-hour, 12-hour day for the most part, and you can only get so much done in that amount of time, whereas I can go up to 24 hours if I wanted with Lumo. So
absolutely. Constraints, like in any industry, of time and manpower.
Yeah. And, a lot of times our guys are doing multiple things at once. So they're not just irrigating, they're having to go bring a crew water because they're in the general area, or they're having to go move a bathroom somewhere, or some guy got a flat tire. So, they're always being pulled away from what they're doing too. And that's where I see a lot of those, extended irrigations can happen, because they were meant to go back and turn a block off at 4, and they don't get around until 5:30, 6. Just there's always variables in farming.
Right. Not to mention, you want your irrigators also focused on fixing issues within the irrigation system. So if they can prioritize their time doing that, that's time they're not spending turning valves.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk math for a moment and quantify the irrigation execution gap. So this is based on data that Lumo collected over the 2024 season. We went through and we analyzed 4,500 irrigations from that season, and we saw that nearly half of time-based irrigations deviated from the planned volume by 10% or more. That means that 50% of all irrigations executed missed their target volume by at least 10%. That's a huge margin of error. And to put that in greater context, Lumo, irrigated 75 million gallons, and we automated 15,000 valve turns. Of that total volume, and this comes back to something that Mark mentioned earlier, growers irrigated 34% overnight. Now, Hunter, is that realistic to do without automation?
Absolutely not. I actually was not considering even doing any overnight irrigations until after I started using Lumo and got kind of trust in the system. And after seeing the data, knowing exactly what was going out, I could feel confident in scheduling those overnight irrigations, and knowing that, if something goes wrong, I can see when it happens. I'll get an alert. I'll know, I can turn things off with the click of a button from my bedstand, and instead of having to rely on someone going out to check and actually verify what happens. There's no way I would be able to confidently do that without Lumo.
Mark, are overnight irrigations something that you often recommend? Do you tend to leave that up to your client when they irrigate? And what are some of the benefits that you've seen through overnight irrigations?
So yeah, I would say, yeah, I would encourage overnight irrigations if it can be done. Unsupervised overnight irrigations, as Hunter alluded to, it's kind of dangerous. If something blows out and you don't have any monitors set up and alerts electronically set up to notify you of that, and then you could have a major problem. So as much as I do like when growers irrigate overnight, it's very rarely done because of that, unless it's automated. But the advantages are, there's some advantages for sure, especially in hot climates, windy climates, where you can lose a lot of moisture, applied moisture, before it even percolates into the soil or infiltrates into the soil. I don't know the exact numbers, and obviously it's going to depend on the weather conditions, but wind and heat will definitely evaporate more rapidly. And you could also get wind's even more detrimental when it blows, like a drip irrigation off path and shreds a little drop into smaller drops, and it basically does a lot of that evaporates. So the efficiency is increased at nighttime. And so when you get a better efficiency of application, more of your water's entering the ground, and you're going to get, and also your vine's not taking up that moisture at that time. It's closed up and sleeping for the night. You're going to get better distribution of that moisture within the soils at night. It's marginal, but it's measurable. So yeah, irrigation at night is definitely an advantage, but very few people do that.
Got it. Thank you, Mark.
Could I jump in and add one more thing too on that note? I feel like I've really seen the overnight irrigations be successful on these really intricate and complex systems where you've got 25 acres or so, but it still takes upwards of a week to get around to irrigate everything, because of how many different irrigation blocks there are, and all the different challenges that these complex systems are. Basically, I've been able to schedule irrigations back to back to back instead of just relying on my irrigator, what he can get done in a 10 or 12 hour window. So instead of taking a week to get around to irrigate, takes me upwards of 3 days, 2 to 3 days at most. And a lot of times that's so helpful when we're applying a lot of stress on the vines, especially during critical times in the growing season, where we're doing pre-veraison water stress and trying not to irrigate pretty much after bloom and flowering up until veraison. So I think that's where it's been really critical for me, being able to have that control and just be able to coordinate that logistically.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Hunter. So let's shift gears a little bit. How do we dial in precision? What do we get out of dialing in precision? And is it possible? Well, first of all, Lumo users were able to increase their efficiency and dial in precision. At the beginning of the season, 75% of all irrigations had over a 10% deviation from the planned volume. By the end of the season, using the data feedback, growers were able to reduce that deviation to 15% of all irrigations. So there's a learning process that occurs over the application throughout a season, taking that data, using the technology to close that gap. Let's illustrate that a little bit for everyone who's joining us today. We've all seen it, we've discussed it, but here's one, Hunter, that you and I actually observed during the season. This is one of your ranches where we saw this really fluctuating low flow rate. We detected it, the system detected it, we sent you an alert. Tell us a little bit more about what you were experiencing on this ranch and what you learned from this data. And did it empower you to make improvements down the road?
Yeah, this was a fun one. I think we were spending a lot of time trying to diagnose what was going on here, because definitely had some wonky flow rates. I think we inherited this system too. It's not like we put this in, so we kind of got this ranch handed to us and needed to take it on without the knowledge of what was actually underground, or it was hard to find any prior plans or specs to go off of. So just trying to like get an understanding of where the pipes are located, where they actually run. We found out that there was multiple main lines, so there was multiple pipes running water to this one block, when I thought there was just one. Diagnosing this issue, I think we had some electrical failures, some pump failures that were taking place all at the same time. We had to, go back and reset the breakers, because the breakers on the electrical panel were failing and shutting the pump off overnight. We just had all sorts of fun issues. So yeah, and we wouldn't have been able to diagnose them easily without having this data to realize that all these problems were happening on a single irrigation set. So it would have taken us a lot longer just to be that to play that detective card and see what was actually happening out in the field. This gives us the power to see any actual trends, or if things are totally shut off, then we know that we'd have to go back and make up for that lost time, that lost irrigation time, and we can actually record that and know what we're lacking out in the field.
So what did you do to make up for what you were actually lacking with this data?
Basically, it was really just easy to see what my intended irrigations were and what went out and what I missed. So it was just a simple bit of math that had to be done on a daily basis of, okay, we only got out 70% of what we intended. So what happened? Was there a problem that we can fix right away? Or once that problem is repaired, then we can go back and fill in the rest of the intended irrigation set. But it wouldn't have been possible without having this data to reference. We would have just been flying blind and just assumed that everything was hunky-dory until we realized, the pumps actually failed for quite a while, and we haven't had our water running at all.
Yeah. Hunter, you bring up a really good point about turnover in vineyard management companies or in-house staff, where someone inherits an irrigation system and you really don't know what's going on behind the scenes until you start looking at data through your irrigation sets. We see a lot of that. I want to share another example. This was similar in a way. We were detecting low flow, but in this case, it was pretty much static. And what this customer found over at Pine Ridge was that they had a filter that was just clogging all the time. And so when they were irrigating without Lumo, they actually were running the risk of underwatering by more than 50%. And now what this customer is able to do is actually watch Lumo. He waits for an alert. When he sees there's a low flow rate alert, he goes and he sends his irrigator out to the ranch to flush the filter, and they take care of it. No more guesswork. They know when they need to make a fix, and we're not underwatering as a consequence. Now, here's a drastic example where we saw low and declining flow across all blocks on a ranch. It turned out that this was a mainline break. So you can actually see here in these charts over the course of the day on different blocks, we were just rapidly losing supply from the pump. You can see, especially in that second chart, that pump is just absolutely struggling to keep up. And we sent an alert. Customer goes out, they check out the ranch, and they say, oh my gosh, we have a huge mainline break. We got to excavate. And we calculated through our observed data that 52,000 gallons that should have gone out to the crops were lost in this mainline break. Now, Hunter, I know firsthand that you've experienced an underground mainline break. How much worse could this have been without live data and alerts? How could this have gone undetected, and what might the consequences have been here?
Yeah, definitely never fun to walk into an unexpected break and just see water gushing. Because you're basically in freak out mode at that point. It's never a great thing to experience, but we can detect things earlier now. It's especially important when we're going through trying to show, potential clients, trying to sell fruit, and what do you see? We walk around the corner, and all of a sudden the vines are just getting, a waterfall of water, and it's, it's bad for the environment. It's wasted water. It's wasted farmland. You lose a fair bit of soil if you have a big erosion problem, if it's on a hillside. It's just never a great thing to deal with. And so anything we can do to detect this earlier, see that something's happening, and send someone out at the right time. Otherwise, you just run the risk of, I've seen main lines break for a number of reasons. We get, little earthquakes up in the mountains here of Sonoma, and shifting soils, can cause lines to break. Large equipment that runs over a main line that isn't buried deep enough because it's an old system, and they only put it down, a foot and a half underground, and then, just all sorts of stuff that's never an easy, fun thing to fix as it's happening. But we can at least get to it earlier now and see what's going on, make the repair as needed, and get back to work, because you don't want to get held up with these things. They shut things down for a while, and your whole system's online for an undetermined amount of time until you get that repair done.
Closing that gap a whole lot faster than you would have been able to otherwise.
Exactly.
Awesome. So in this next example here, we detected a high flow rate. We sent an alert, got a call from the customer saying, you know what, guys? Turns out there are twice as many emitters in this block as we thought. I inherited this system. This is a perfect example of in-house staff turnover. I inherited this system. I didn't really know what was going on with it. I was watering like I thought I should. And then when I saw this data, I realized something was wrong in my records. And I went out and I walked each row, and I realized we had double the number of emitters. And all this time I've been overwatering to a wide extent. So Mark and Loni, let me shift this one over to Loni. Loni, what are the risks of overwatering like this so significantly? What could have occurred if this were happening all season long, unknown?
I mean, aside from just wasting water, there are periods during the growing season when you're trying to apply stress, and that will inhibit quality if you're applying double the irrigation that you're intending to. I mean, typically we recommend, 2 emitters per plant, but yeah, if this person had 2 times as many or something, and they were actually irrigating, 4 times as much, I mean, your calculus is off, the amount of water you're giving it is off. If we have plant stress sensors in these blocks, we have some, sense of plant stress. It's not that big of a deal because, you're irrigating based on plant stress. But if you don't, if you're just going off, what your soil moisture probe is reading, or some other calculus you're doing, then yeah, irrigating twice as much. It's it's not good math. It's not good farming, and you're ultimately sacrificing quality.
If I could add just a little bit, I think there are some checks on this, so it's not completely disastrous because we do look at soil moisture. If you're irrigating double that than you think you're applying, well, then the water doesn't deplete as fast. It stays in the soil. We see a depletion, in the soil moisture to return to the same level. It will take longer time. So we would stretch out our irrigations accordingly. So it's not the end of the world when you have more than one emitter, but it's frustrating because it's always good to know. Now, if you're irrigating using ET as your basis, then that will screw you up because you're applying twice as much as your ET is based on, and you're not getting the feedback. Mm-hmm. That's why we always recommend, regardless of what system you're using, to quantify the irrigation volume to check the soil moisture. It gives you that kind of feedback. And the floor pulse is what we use, or other type of plant stress sensor to give you that feedback will help. But just another point. This is what we get frustrated with more than anything is when people plug in extra emitters in certain areas. And so you have a non-uniform application of water built in if you got 3 emitters on that vine, 1 emitter on that vine, or maybe a 2 gallon per hour or a 4 gallon per hour on this vine and a 1 gallon per hour on another vine. That's the kind of stuff that really drives us crazy, which you don't always see. It could definitely show reflect in the graph you're showing right now, though. What is your actual output? But if it's non-uniform, then it's just all over the place, and that's not what anybody wants to do.
Yeah, people do that all the time. Yeah. It's like they got a bag of emitters and they think every bag of emitters is the same as every other bag of emitters. And so, yeah, like a bunch of vines have like a gallon here, 2 gallons here, half a gallon here. It's and it's all over the place. And it's not even just about messing up, your irrigation distribution uniformity, but if your DU is really bad and you're fertigating, that means that all of your vines, all your fertilizer, is also getting, a disproportionate application. You're also, administering your fertilizer in a way that is disproportionate. So, you're wondering why, in a lot of these hillside vineyards where you get poor DU anyway, because your pump is undersized or your filter's clogged for whatever reason, it's like there's multiple reasons why it looks great at the bottom of the hill and looks like crap at the top of the hill. And a lot of it too is that anytime you're giving it nitrogen, you're giving, a half a dose to the top and you're giving a double dose to the bottom. And these things they kind of just snowball over time, and you end up years down the road with, really weak areas and really strong areas. And then you try to fix it by popping in a bunch of other emitters, and it just exacerbates the problem. So there's a lot of crazy janky things out there that, maybe it wasn't your fault, maybe you inherited the system, and now you've just got to play catch up. We've seen this in new vineyards too. Yeah. So I guess it's not even just that. We've seen new vineyards that are installed horribly, so.
Absolutely. Yeah, you both made some great points there that I want to come back to in a little bit, especially talking about that feedback loop of looking at data, not just beyond your flow and pressure, but soil moisture, plant stress, and distribution uniformity. We see that every time we install a system, like you said, Loni, it doesn't matter if it's a new development or if it's a 25-year-old system, there's going to be some math that should add up that does not. And we're going to talk about how we combat that in a moment. So to recap, we've spoke about most of the consequences, most of the costs of the irrigation execution gap. Wasted time, effort, and water, lower labor productivity and water efficiency. We're burning more fuel, driving more trucks. We're increasing pumping costs, running the pump during the day at peak energy hours. And we are finding worse crop outcomes when we're under or over irrigating. Now, let's talk about how we close this gap. And we've touched on points here and there. Loni, you were just talking about distribution uniformity and seeing these inconsistencies, whether it's a new development or a 25-year-old vineyard. And when we look at the expected flow rate of a block, for example, the math should, in theory, work out to tell us, based on the vine count and the emitter rates, what that flow rate should be that we can measure uniformity against. But in reality, you've got clogged emitters, you've got people plugging in extra emitters, you've got 5 fewer vines in one row than the record shows you do. And so suddenly, when we start looking at this data and saying what's normal or what's not normal, what's on target or not, our numbers are actually askew. And so we can introduce a real baseline based on historical data of that block to properly measure against, rather than the theoretical math. We also can leverage this data to correct irrigation system issues. We've talked about that. Hunter, you spoke quite a bit about that earlier. And we can implement precision irrigation strategies. So what are some of the steps that we can take to dial in precision? We've got that baseline to establish. What is your normal flow rate in that block? What are the known issues? How many issues are there? How can we fix them as soon as possible? We can perform data-driven maintenance based on that block level flow data. That means no more waiting until a catastrophic event occurs. You see an issue, you go fix it the next day. And finally, as Mark, you were talking about, we can close that data loop with a suite of sensors. Now, Hunter, what is the reality of implementing these steps with automation versus without automation? And you've done a lot of this in the past year with Lumo. Are we reallocating irrigator hours? Are they focusing on bigger problems rather than turning valves? What has been your experience?
Yeah, it's been great actually. A lot of the time that my my irrigators would be spending out in the field just turning systems on or just opening valves gets relocated and reallocated to correcting issues that I can catch. Ideally, I would be monitoring throughout the day and then also the following day reviewing what had happened, what I missed, what problems occurred. And then my irrigator kind of became my repairman in that sense. He would go and he would diagnose or help repair and figure out what I diagnosed that morning from the previous day or midday. I noticed there was an issue happening right as a block turns on. He would be my eyes and ears to go check and make sure that that things were going smoothly and correct the problem if it wasn't. So instead of just turning on a valve and waiting to see for a problem to occur, he was able to get around ranch to ranch and correct those problems and repair those issues a lot more quickly. And yeah, we all I think know that the way that automation is going and technology is evolving so quickly. This is just the obvious next step for us to make sure that things get done exactly how we plan them, and to be able to execute that in an efficient way is sort of our main goal here. We're always trying to save labor, save our clients labor, and be able to reduce our costs. It helps everyone's bottom line.
Yeah, at the end of the day, your job is to make your customer look better to their boss, right? Anything we can do to bring costs down, labor, water, energy, otherwise reflects good on everyone. It's good for the environment. It's good for the crops. I want to talk about some examples. I also want to come back to this statistic that we talked about earlier, where earlier in the season, 75% of all Lumo irrigations were missing their target by over 10%. That's a huge, huge number. And taking those steps that we just discussed has helped growers bring that down to only 15% of irrigations. 85% are now on target because people were able to learn about their systems through data, make changes to how they allocate labor out in the field, and improve their operations. They're also able to trial new irrigation strategies. In this case, we had a grower out in Lodi who had always wanted to run 30-minute sets alternating between 2 blocks over the course of an entire day during a heat wave, just to try it out. And it had never been a reality before because, right, you're not going to have someone sit outside for 12 hours between 2 valves, opening and closing them every 30 minutes. But what we see here is that after taking these steps to dial in their system to achieve that precision, look how pristine this data is here. We're looking at consistent durations, consistent volumes, about half a gallon per vine, consistent flow rates matching with what the system says it should be, because the grower took the time using Lumo to dial in and get precise about what they're executing in the field. And we just thought this was a phenomenal example of what you can achieve when you line up all your numbers through these strategies. Now, coming back to something Mark and Loni had mentioned earlier with new developments, sometimes we put in a new development and the math works out perfectly. It's beautiful, right? It lines up right away. Usually, though, that's not the case. In this case that we're looking at, this was a new development off of Silverado Trail in Napa. And you see here's a set of irrigations over multiple days on the same block. The first two that occurred toward the bottom of your screen here were before we implemented a Lumo feature called Smart Baseline. Smart Baseline is a machine learning feature that takes your historical flow data from the block and establishes a new baseline based on the reality, not the math of the emitters and vine counts. And so after a couple irrigations, we start to take that data, the machine does its learning, and comes back with what we establish as the new baseline to compare against. And suddenly you see these statuses here shift from irregular to normal, indicating that these irrigations are falling within 10% of the expected volume. Now, Mark and Loni, what improvements do you see in crop quality when clients closely adhere to your data-based recommendations? What are some things that might happen when you're putting in a new development? You've got young vines and you want to be precise. How does that benefit the grower?
Yeah, there's really two questions there. So, just on a new planting, efficient irrigation is important. When we're training our vines up, there's no desire to stress the vines, except maybe at the end of the year, so they stop growing. Unlike a mature vine where we have periods of stress that are desirable. But the main thing is to keep so the root zone moist but not wet, so that the vine can grow. Likewise, delivery of fertilizers without water, so that because we're probably putting on smaller amounts of fertilizer, whether it's organic or conventional, during the growing season to provide especially the nitrogen for the growth. We don't want to overdo it, or we'll overstimulate the vine growth and get long internodes, and that's not good for the establishment of a vineyard, or the other way around. Too short internodes isn't good either. So really, it's about maintaining a moist root zone and following that root zone as it grows, or maybe going a little below the root zone intentionally, so that the roots will grow into that moist soil. So we can be really precise. It's not nearly as critical as far as obviously for wine quality, we're not growing wine, but to establish the vine, it's important to keep it moist. For a mature vineyard, then we really need to be fairly precise, especially during key periods. Post fruit set to veraison is really kind of the period that we're really trying to slow the canopy down and also apply some stress. So we want to put the brakes on the vegetative growth at some point when they're long enough, but we also want to increase the stress level of the vine, which enhances the secondary metabolism of the fruit for the maturation phase after veraison. So we put a lot of the things we do before veraison, stress wise, will impact it, usually in a positive manner if it's not taken too far, the ripening of the fruit after veraison. In that point, we can relieve the stress. So being real precise about our irrigations, or not irrigating at all during certain periods of time, is important for wine quality, and especially for red grapes. Applies to whites differently, but somewhat similarly. Again, we want the vines to grow vegetatively to a certain point, and then we want them to stop growing, and that applies pretty much every growing season. And this is the tool we have. So if we over irrigate unintentionally, then we can overshoot our target or undershoot our target.
Mm-hmm. I think just to add on young vineyards, is a lot of people I think that you really can't go wrong with the more water the better. And at a certain point you do kind of want to stretch your irrigations, in order to train those young roots to go deeper. We've seen places where they've over irrigated and the vines just never really learn how to go deep for any moisture. And we've also seen this cause issues in hardiness. You want your vines to harden off prior to winter. And we've seen places that had winter kill, and it wasn't really at least in this case, it wasn't really the fault of over irrigation. It's just they planted on a floodplain, and we had a really wet winter, and it was just a lake for a long period of time. And then the vines just really didn't really accrue any cold hardiness, and they ended up suffering some winter kill and what do you call it in English? Crown gall. They had some issues with crown gall because of that. So it's not really trivial how you water a young vineyard. That's it. Yeah.
Thanks. That was a great addition, Loni. Hunter, is there anything you want to add on this subject before we move on?
I mean, I agree 100% with everything Mark and Loni have said, and I would be curious to know if after implementing Lumo last year on our end, because we use Mark and Loni quite a bit and some of our ranches as a consulting, and I'm curious to see if you guys had noticed if we actually were better in performing our recommendations, this past year in 2024, as opposed to previous years, and if there was a big difference there.
Yeah, I would say
go back and think. Yeah.
No, but I believe that I have seen some improvement. I'm trying to think back specifically because it's hard to have a good memory, but I do believe you have. I see more regularity in the irrigations than I used to, and that's good. I really like it when clients such as yourself will do a regular irrigation. If we say twice a week, one Monday and Thursday maybe, that way gives us a chance to say, well, okay, that's too much. Let's stretch out the irrigations or let's irrigate lower volume. When there's the most frustrating thing I see is when we have growers who just haphazardly, they may follow our recommendations, but not really any regularity. We love to see that heartbeat kind of with the water going up, water coming down, water going up, water going down. That gives us a chance to really fine-tune irrigations. And so automation really feeds into that because that gives you that ability to schedule that in advance. And so people, including our EVM, who do the automated irrigations are I would say easier to work with, but also more effective in because we can make modifications or make adjustments during the growing season, not just nobody wants to hear the same thing all 20 weeks of the year, and that's kind of what we deal with when we see growers just kind of irrigating whenever they remember to. But when you have an irrigation system that's automated, you really can get in there and become a repeat. And of course, you have 7 days of the week. That's frustrating because we want that leaves you an odd number or different number of intervals. We can specify a 4-day or schedule for 4-day intervals if we want to, and so regardless if it's Sunday, we can still irrigate. Anyway, it's way more effective for us to work with a grower that applies irrigation on an automated basis, in an automated fashion, because we have that closed loop. We're involved in the loop, but we can make changes very effectively.
Yeah, nothing like telling someone, hey, irrigate twice a week until they irrigate on Monday and they irrigate again on Tuesday, and they don't irrigate for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I know that technically follows the recommendation, but I guess it's like exercise, consistency. Not that I would know anything about that, but I hear consistency and exercise are good things that go together. So
it sounds like you're telling us that you're observing greater synergy between the viticulturist, the person making the recommendations for irrigation, and what's actually being implemented by the vineyard manager, the irrigation team.
Yeah. The ideal situation, for us as consultants is, we make a recommendation, and the faster we can get to following that and then seeing how the plant responds to that and then making necessary tweaks to it. And at that point, it's like you already have a schedule. So it's like, okay, add an extra half an hour onto each of those, or, stretch it out by 1 day. And you get into a groove where you're just happy with it. And then it's kind of the same recommendation up until something changes physiologically with the vine. Like okay, that's a good schedule. We got there in the matter of 3 weeks. We got to this point that we like, stick with it, until lag phase, So, I mean, the ideal situation is that, for everyone involved is that this is a simple project or simple process, and you have your schedule and you make the necessary adjustments and you get into a good groove and you just kind of stick there for a while until it's 105 degrees for 2 weeks, and you change it up a little bit, but the faster you can get from no knowledge to having the knowledge and then applying what you need to apply and getting to the right schedule, like, just the better it is for everyone. Makes my job easier. So
very well said, and a perfect segue to summarizing the benefits of closing this irrigation execution gap. So, as we've discussed, greater water, labor, and energy efficiency. We're enabling more strategic irrigation practices to allow for greater precision. We're improving our crop outcomes. And all of these three things allow for more sustainable and productive business. Before we wrap up, I'll just ask Mark, Hunter, if either Loni, if any of you have anything else you want to add or any slides you want to go back to and chat a little further about, that'd be great. Otherwise, I'll move on to conclusions and thank yous.
Yeah, I don't have any necessarily we haven't discussed already. I just believe that everybody has different soil. We're all trying to do the best we can, but irrigation efficiency it's a nice thing to have, but it's getting to be more and more essential to have. And so it goes beyond just making a better wine quality, even though that's been always our motivation. But more and more, we're really, especially we do work a lot in the Central Coast. It's becoming very imperative that we save water, and really automation allows you to fine tune, especially some of these difficult soils. We see a lot, especially in the Central Coast, very light textured soils that just can't hold a whole lot of water. If you irrigate more than 2 or 3 hours, you're essentially blasting it past the root zone. And irrigation automation really allows you to manage those soils way more effectively than trying to do it manually. Period. End of story. In my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add, from an end of year and a record keeping standpoint, it's really been helpful to have all this data to reference. I think we were able to get everything compiled on an Excel sheet of all the irrigations across all of our dozens of ranches and thousands of acres, and we do a lot of water reporting that is required depending on where you are in the county, and just being able to have an easly attainable record instead of having to dig through all the scraps of paper that we used to have to try and keep memory of, and trying to bug my irrigators of, oh, what week did you irrigate this block for 12 hours, and what let me find the notebook that you lost in your truck a month back, and try and remember all the irrigations that we put out across the year. It's really been helpful in just trying to get all of that in one uniform place to reference and to generate and send out as needed.
Yeah, those are great parallel points. I mean, talking about a changing climate and drought with increased water use reporting at the same time. And that's a whole other subject for another webinar. But Mark and Loni, you deal a lot with water use reporting. How are you seeing that change in a brief 30-second overview of the landscape?
I mean, I think the bar is set very low in viticulture with respect to like almost every other crop, as far as recording. I mean, yeah, it's like the filthy notebook in the bottom of someone's pickup, and that's what has been used to, take, scribbles of whatever was written on a flow meter, and most flow meters don't work, that are out there. So yeah, it's becoming more of a necessity. I think there's some pushback politically, at least, but again, that's also a whole other webinar to talk about, especially down south. But it's becoming more and more, imperative. I mean, we're going to start having to pay for water, at least most places are toying with it, whether we like it or not, in the next 10 years, which frankly makes sense. And most other, countries that deal with drought and, the same way that we do, have to report water and pay for it if they're going to go over a certain amount. And yeah, I mean, it costs money to take that water out, whether it be electricity or diesel or whatever. And it doesn't all necessarily end up back in the aquifer. There are basins all over the state of California that are overdrawn. And that's going to affect, it's going to affect a whole lot of things. It's going to affect your property value, which means a lot in California. So yeah, it's kind of a weird tangent, I guess. I don't know. What else? I don't know.
Well, I think is it fair to say there that as we increase precision, it's also going to lend itself to our reporting, because no longer are we going to be over or under reporting to the state or county, and no one's going to be, taxed or assessed fees based on an estimate. That we actually will have this data of precision that we can hand over to the authorities when required.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not measuring, you're guessing. That's kind of our slogan. And yeah, I mean, you're actually measuring something. It's not just measuring how long your pump was on for, and from there just doing calculus and, and not accounting for all the drops in pressure you have, all the changes in emitters. You're actually measuring, this is how much water went into this block, whether it was because of a blowout or extra emitters or clogged emitters or whatever. So you actually have a number, and from there you can affect change. Which I think is probably, I think, what more people are interested in right now than just having it as a reporting tool. But yeah, the reporting tool is eventually going to get there, and some people are already dealing with that, depending on where they are in the state.
We'll file that under the coming soon banner.
Yeah, people love flow meters. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us for today's conversation. Hunter, Mark, and Loni, really appreciate your time. Thank you to Kim and the team at Wine Industry Network for hosting the webinar, for having Lumo. And thank you to everyone who has joined in to listen. We appreciate your time and look forward to helping you with your precision irrigation strategies.